television.
It is a warm English night in August of 1938, the last year of peace before the outbreak of World War II. A German nobleman is on a secret visit to London on a mission that many in Germany would call treason. He is one of a group of powerful anti-Nazis who are poised to overthrow Adolf Hitler now and bring a halt to his march toward war. All they need from the British government to set their coup in motion is a firm declaration that if Hitler steps foot in Czechoslovakia, Britain and France will declare war. But Britain betrays the plotters who have risked their lives to warn her, not just once, but twice. Soon all of Europe is swept up in war, a war that could have been stopped by stopping Hitler. By 1932, Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party have won the support of about a third of Germany's voters. The huge German war debts and the Depression have created enormous hardship. The public mood is ugly, and the Weimar government, weakened by internal intrigues, flounders in the face of growing unrest. To many, the Nazi party seems to promise jobs, food, and the return of order. Others are not deceived. They are appalled by Hitler's violent nationalism and his anti-Semitism. As Chancellor of Germany in 1933, Hitler and his Nazi party conduct the bloodiest election campaign in European history. But over half of Germany's voters still oppose them.
They got about 43% of the popular vote, but that was after 4 weeks of terror in the streets. The SA, the stormtroopers, terrorizing the population, and in many polling stations, uniformed SAs standing next to the voting booths and watching what people marked. It must be remembered that Hitler and the National Socialists never had majority support.
Hitler now abandons all pretense of democracy. He assumes dictatorial powers. The persecution of opponents escalates. Those who speak out openly risk arrest and being shut away in camps. In June of 1934, Hitler orders SS troops to shoot about 100 of his critics, along with some stormtrooper leaders whose loyalty he doubts.
It was a very strong signal to all those who contemplated opposition or resistance or intrigue against the regime not to do so, or to expect the consequences, namely that they would very likely be shot. And it was clear that Hitler would not stop before any group or any level or class of society. If it was the military leadership, he would probably shoot them too.
Still, resistance remains and quietly grows among a number of prominent Germans. Ewald von Kleist is a German landowner who narrowly escapes being shot in the purge of June 1934. He's made no secret of his view that Hitler will ruin Germany.
alarmierte ihn die außenpolitische Zielsetzung, die da
What
lautete:
alarmed him mostly were the external political goals which said that Germany, the Germany of Adolf Hitler, had not only the duty but also the right to reign over Europe and to extend this reign all the way to the borders of Siberia. It was very clear to him that with such a foreign policy program, whose seriousness he didn't doubt, the end of Germany was assured.
Das Ende Deutschlands, heute würde man sagen, vorprogrammiert.
It was with this in mind that he directed his future steps.
Also Schritte gerichtet.
Kleist is not alone in opposing Hitler's growing militarism. In 1936, in a flagrant violation of the Treaty of Versailles, Hitler's troops march into the Rhineland. He gambles that France and Britain won't act to stop him, and he's right. But Karl Goerdeler, mayor of the city of Leipzig, knows that taking back the Rhineland is just the beginning of Hitler's aggression. Goerdeler has already resigned as price commissioner under Hitler, unable to redirect his spending away from arms. Now he resigns as mayor of Leipzig, too, after the Nazis remove a memorial to the composer Felix Mendelssohn because Mendelssohn was a Jew.
The monument was taken away when he was in Finland for some lecture. And when he came home, he said, it is to be brought back or I leave. They didn't bring it back, the Nazis. They didn't wish to do that, so he left his office. What's interesting, I think, in my father is that he didn't only quit his job, but that he had now another plan to oppose to Hitler, to go into a form of real resistance.
In 1938, Hitler stirs up trouble in neighboring Austria. In March, his troops march in. It's another bloodless victory for the Führer, as Britain and France, again, do little to protest. Emboldened by their silence, Hitler firms up his plans to move into Czechoslovakia by the fall. But his Army Chief of Staff, General Ludwig Beck, refuses to believe that Britain and France will abandon their ally Czechoslovakia. Beck believes that the strong Czech military, backed up by Britain and France, will crush the German army, which is not yet strong enough to win. When Hitler won't listen to his arguments, Beck resigns and begins to think about a coup. From Berlin, a strong opposition is now taking shape against Hitler. Men who are ready to overthrow him to stop war. General Beck is the plotters' military leader, Karl Goerdeler, the former mayor of Leipzig, their civilian chief. Evil von Kleist will play a major part in seeking help from the British government. So will Ernst von Weizsäcker, a high-ranking civil servant who runs the German Foreign Office. Weizsäcker will be aided by two of his employees, the brothers Erich and Theo Kort. The conspirators know that their coup has no chance without support from the German people, and that support will depend on one thing. The people must understand that by attacking Czechoslovakia, Hitler will bring them not another easy victory, but bloody conflict and certain defeat. And to make sure they understand this, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain must publicly and bluntly tell Hitler, so that the German people know that invading Czechoslovakia means war.
Es musste ihm nachgewiesen werden, dass Hitler
It had to be proved to the people that Hitler was prepared to unleash a war into which Britain would enter as the enemy of Germany. A coordinated effort between a British diplomatic stand and the German resistance could have led to the overthrow of the regime, because the German people were not willing to enter a new war. They were not at all ready to accept a war with Britain.
But in Britain, the public is even less eager for war than the Germans are. And British officials are not interested in standing up to Hitler. They have been trying to appease him for years.